Mafia boss Paralyzed's son sat alone at her birthday, until a black maid said, "Can I join you?" The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble floor of the Rossetti mansion, its 1,000 tiny lights reflecting off champagne flutes and diamond jewelry. Outside, Chicago's autumn wind rattled the windows, but inside the grand ballroom, warmth and laughter filled every corner, except one. Vinny Rossetti stood at the edge of the celebration, his steel-gray eyes scanning the room like a hawk surveying its territory. At 52, he commanded respect with just a glance. His tailored Italian suit cost more than most people's cars, and the subtle bulge beneath his left arm reminded everyone why they called him the Wolf of Little Italy. Tonight, however, the most feared man in Chicago felt powerless. The birthday party he'd thrown for his 12-year-old son Marco cost more than a small wedding. He'd hired the Chicago Symphony String Quartet, flown in a celebrity chef from New York, and filled the room with every influential family from the North Shore. Judges, business owners, they all came when Vincent Rossetti called. Their children ran around in designer clothes, laughing and playing games that cost more than the average person's monthly salary. But none of them sat with his son. Marco Rossetti sat alone at the birthday table, a magnificent creation of white linen and gold trim positioned perfectly in the center of the room. The wheelchair he'd been confined to for 3 years seemed to create an invisible barrier around him. Other children would approach, drawn by curiosity, or their parents whispered encouragements, but they never stayed long. They'd mumble, "Happy birthday," before quickly rejoining their friends, leaving Marco to watch the celebration of his own life from the sidelines. Vincent remembered when Marco could run. Before the accident that shattered more than just his spine, it had broken something in Vincent's carefully constructed world. The doctors said a drunk driver had changed everything in an instant, but Vincent knew better. The crash hadn't been random. It was a message, delivered in the most painful way possible to a man who thought himself untouchable. "Mr. Rossetti?" A nervous voice interrupted his thoughts. Tommy Marconi, one of his lieutenants, approached with careful steps. "The photographer wants to take pictures of Marco with the other kids." Vincent's jaw tightened as he watched the photographer trying to arrange a group shot. The other children stood awkwardly around Marco's wheelchair, their smiles forced and uncomfortable. Marco's own smile looked painted on, a brave face he'd learned to wear to protect his father's feelings. "Tell him to wait," Vincent said quietly. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority, but underneath lay something raw and vulnerable that only appeared when he looked at his son. The ballroom buzzed with conversation, but Vincent only heard fragments. Business deals disguised as casual chat. Compliments on the party that felt more like political maneuvering. Everyone wanted something from him, even here, even tonight. But what he wanted, what he'd trade his entire empire for, was to see his son laugh the way he used to. Marco picked at his slice of birthday cake, a masterpiece that cost $800 and tasted like sawdust in his mouth. The chocolate was imported from Belgium, the frosting made with organic vanilla from Madagascar, but it couldn't sweeten the bitter taste of loneliness. He could feel the stares, hear the whispered conversations about poor little Marco, and how brave he was. They meant well, but their pity felt heavier than the wheelchair itself. The entertainment his father had hired, magicians, balloon artists, even a small circus troupe, performed with enthusiasm that felt desperate. They worked extra hard when they noticed Marco watching, as if their tricks could somehow make him forget about the legs that no longer worked, the dreams of playing baseball that had died in twisted metal and shattered glass. Mrs. Henderson, the mayor's wife, approached the birthday table with her daughter Emma in tow. "Marco, sweetie, Emma wanted to wish you happy birthday." She pushed the reluctant 10-year-old forward. Emma fidgeted with her pink dress, avoiding eye contact. Happy birthday, Marco. I like your chair. It's really fast-looking." Marco forced another smile. "Thanks, Emma. Want some cake? It's really good." But Emma had already spotted her friends across the room. "Maybe later," she said, backing away. "I see Ashley over there. Mom, can I go play?" And just like that, Marco was alone again. Vincent watched the exchange from across the room, his hands clenched into fists. He'd built an empire through fear and respect, but he couldn't force children to befriend his son. He couldn't threaten loneliness into submission or buy genuine friendship with all his money and power. The birthday boy sat surrounded by abundance, mountains of presents wrapped in golden paper, flowers that cost more than luxury cars, food that would feed a small village, yet he looked like the poorest child in the room. His dark eyes, so much like his father's, held a sadness that 12-year-olds shouldn't know. As the string quartet played another cheerful melody and the adults continued their networking disguised as socializing, Marco made a wish that had nothing to do with the candles he'd already blown out. He wished for just one person to sit with him, not because they had to, not because their parents told them to, but because they wanted to. Unknown to either father or son, that wish was about to be answered in the most unexpected way. In the mansion's gleaming kitchen, 30 feet away from the grand ballroom, Grace Washington moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent 15 years perfecting the art of being invisible. At 41, she knew every creak in the Rossetti mansion's floors, every preference of its inhabitants, and exactly how to clean crystal without leaving a single fingerprint. Tonight, she wore the same black uniform as the other staff members, her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, her movements precise as she arranged canapes on silver trays. But unlike the others, Grace couldn't stop glancing through the service door's small window into the ballroom. She'd been watching Marco since he was 7 years old, had seen him transform from an energetic boy who would sneak into the kitchen for extra cookies into the quiet child who now sat alone at his own birthday party. Grace had been there the night of the accident, had held Vincent Rossetti, one of Chicago's most dangerous men, as he sobbed in the hospital waiting room like any other terrified father. "Grace, table 6 needs more champagne," called Maria, the head server, bustling past with practiced urgency. Grace nodded but didn't move immediately. Through the window, she watched another child approach Marco's table, only to drift away after a few awkward words. The birthday boy's smile never wavered, but Grace had learned to read the pain behind it. She'd seen that same forced cheerfulness on her own son's face 20 years ago, before leukemia took him at age 8. "You gonna stand there all night, or you gonna help?" snapped Carlos, the newest server, shouldering past her with a tray of dirty plates. He was young, maybe 25, and still thought working for Vincent Rossetti was just about the money. Grace knew better. She'd taken this job not for the generous salary, but because she needed to disappear. Detroit had become too dangerous after she testified against the wrong people, and Vincent's reputation for protecting his household staff was legendary. What she hadn't expected was to care so deeply about the family she served. She loaded another tray with appetizers, her dark hands steady despite the turmoil in her chest. In the ballroom, the string quartet played something cheerful and expensive, but Grace heard the silence around Marco's table louder than any music. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Child, when you see someone hurting and you got the power to help, you got the responsibility to act." Grandma Washington had lived through Jim Crow, had cleaned houses for families who barely acknowledged her existence, but she'd never let cruelty or loneliness pass unchallenged when she could do something about it. Grace understood her place in this house. She knew the invisible lines that separated staff from family, black from white, servant from served. In 15 years, she'd never crossed those boundaries. She kept her head down, did her work, and stayed grateful for the safety Vincent's protection provided. But watching Marco sit alone at his birthday party was breaking something inside her chest. "Mrs. Washington?" The voice belonged to Sophia, Vincent's housekeeper and the only person who used Grace's formal name. "Mr. Rossetti wants the good china for the cake service." Grace nodded, but as Sophia walked away, she made a decision that surprised even herself. She untied her apron, smoothed her uniform, and stepped out from behind the service barrier that had defined her world for 15 years. The ballroom felt different from this side. Bigger. More intimidating. The conversation seemed louder, the laughter sharper. Grace had cleaned this room 1,000 times, but she'd never walked through it as anything other than a shadow. Several guests glanced at her curiously. She recognized most of them, federal judges whose houses she'd worked in before coming here, business owners whose dirty secrets she'd accidentally overheard, whose personal lives would scandalize their voters. They looked at her the way people looked at furniture that had unexpectedly started moving. Marcos sat exactly where she'd seen him through the window, but up close, his loneliness hit her like a physical blow. His small hands rested on the wheelchair's armrests, and his dark eyes, so much like his father's, stared at the untouched cake before him. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. She could turn around. Should turn around. Go back to the kitchen where she belonged, where she was safe. Instead, she walked closer. Marco looked up as her shadow fell across his table. His expression shifted from surprise to confusion. In his world, staff members didn't approach unless summoned, didn't speak unless spoken to. Grace's throat felt dry as sandpaper, but she managed to speak. "Excuse me, sweetheart." Her voice was gentle but clear enough to carry over the ambient noise. "I was wondering, can I join you?" The question hung in the air between them like a bridge neither had expected to see. Marco blinked several times, his young mind struggling to process this unprecedented moment. Across the room, conversations continued, but Grace felt as if the entire world had suddenly focused on this one table, this one moment of connection reaching across every barrier that society had built between them. Marco's face transformed slowly, like sunrise breaking over the horizon. The painted-on smile became something real, something warm and grateful and surprised. He nodded eagerly. "Yes, please. I'd really like that." For the first time all evening, the birthday boy had company. Grace settled into the chair beside Marco with the careful grace of someone who'd spent years moving through spaces where she didn't quite belong. The ornate golden chair felt strange beneath her. She was more accustomed to standing, serving, cleaning. But Marco's genuine smile made every uncomfortable moment worth it. "This is some party your daddy threw for you," Grace said, gesturing toward the elaborate decorations. Her voice carried the warm cadence of someone who'd grown up in the South before making her way north. "I've been working here for 15 years, and I ain't never seen anything quite like this." Marco's eyes lit up with unexpected pride. "Dad hired the same people who did the mayor's daughter's wedding last year. The flowers came from some special place in Holland." He pointed to the massive arrangements of white roses and gold-dusted lilies. "Each one of those centerpieces costs more than most people spend on groceries in a month." "Honey, I spend more on groceries in a month than most people spend on their cars." Grace laughed, and something in her easy humor made Marco giggle, the first genuine laugh he'd produced all evening. "But you know what? All those fancy flowers can't hold a candle to the dandelions that used to grow in my grandmother's backyard in Alabama." "Dandelions?" Marco leaned forward, curious. "But those are weeds." "That's what everybody said." Grace nodded, cutting a small piece of Marco's untouched birthday cake. "But my grandmama, she saw things different. She used to tell me, Gracie, some folks see dandelions as weeds 'cause they pop up anywhere they please, don't ask permission, don't need fancy soil or special care. But those same flowers that folks try so hard to get rid of, they're the first ones to bloom in spring, bringing sunshine to places that been dark all winter." Marco considered this seriously. "So she thought they were better than regular flowers? She thought they were braver," Grace said, taking a bite of the expensive cake. This is good, baby. Your daddy sure knows how to throw a party. But I bet you anything my grandmama's pound cake would give this fancy Belgian chocolate a run for its money." "You can cook?" Marco asked, then immediately looked embarrassed. "I mean, I know you work in the kitchen sometimes, but—" "Sweetheart, I can cook like you wouldn't believe," Grace grinned. "When I was your age, I could make cornbread from scratch, fry chicken that would make grown men cry, and bake biscuits so fluffy they practically floated off the table. Had to learn young. My mama worked 3 jobs, so it was either learn to cook or starve." Marco's eyes widened. 3 jobs? Why? Grace's expression grew thoughtful. "This was back in Detroit before I came here. Sometimes life deals you a hand that ain't fair, and you got to play it anyway. But you know what? Some of my happiest memories are from that little kitchen, standing on a milk crate so I could reach the stove, learning to turn whatever we had into something good. "What's your favorite thing to cook?" Marco asked, and Grace noticed he'd unconsciously scooted his wheelchair closer to her chair. "Well," Grace said conspiratorially, "don't tell the fancy chef your daddy hired, but I make a sweet potato pie that could convert a vegetarian. The secret is in the spices, a little nutmeg, some vanilla, and just a pinch of cardamom that most folks never think to add." Marco laughed again, louder this time. "Cardamom? That sounds like something from a fantasy movie." "Baby, cooking is magic," Grace said seriously. "You take simple things, flour, sugar, eggs, and you mix them with love and patience, and suddenly you got something that can bring a whole family together around a table." Their conversation had grown animated enough to attract attention. Mrs. Patterson, the wife of a federal judge, glanced over curiously. Then Emma Henderson, the mayor's daughter who'd awkwardly wished Marco happy birthday earlier, looked up from her conversation with two other girls. "Why is Marco laughing so much?" Emma whispered to her friend Ashley. Grace noticed the attention but didn't stop talking. "Now, my grandmama also taught me the art of making something from nothing. One time, all we had in the house was some leftover rice, a can of tomatoes, and about half an onion. But she turned that into this amazing dish she called Sunday Surprise." "What was the surprise?" Marco asked, completely absorbed in her story. "The surprise was that it tasted better than any fancy restaurant meal I'd ever had." Grace chuckled. "Course, I was only 8 years old, so my restaurant experience was limited to McDonald's, but still." Marco burst into delighted laughter, and the sound carried across the ballroom like music. Several more children glanced over, drawn by the infectious joy radiating from the birthday table. "You were 8 and cooking?" Marco asked incredulously. "8 and burning a lot of food," Grace corrected. "But my grandmama was patient. She'd say, 'Gracie, burnt beans teach you as much as perfect ones. Maybe more.'" Tommy Richardson, a 10-year-old from one of Chicago's most prominent families, abandoned his conversation with the magician and wandered closer to Marco's table. He'd never heard the birthday boy sound so happy. "What else did your grandmother teach you?" Marco asked eagerly. Grace smiled, noticing the small crowd beginning to form around them. "Oh honey, we got all night. And trust me, my grandmama had wisdom for every occasion." For the first time since the party began, Marco was exactly where he wanted to be. As Marco laughed at another of Grace's stories about her grandmother's cooking adventures, a small group of children had quietly gathered within earshot. Emma Henderson stood closest, having abandoned her friends when she heard Marco's genuine laughter. Tommy Richardson lingered nearby, pretending to examine the elaborate ice sculpture while actually listening to Grace's warm voice. Even Ashley Chin, notorious for her shyness, had inched closer with her plate of cake. Grace noticed the audience but didn't acknowledge them directly, understanding instinctively that drawing attention to their curiosity might scare them away. Instead, she continued her conversation with Marco, letting the warmth between them create a natural invitation. "You know what, sweetheart?" Grace said, her voice taking on a slightly different tone. "I just realized something. Here we are, talking and laughing at your birthday party, and I haven't given you a proper gift yet." Marco looked confused. "You don't have to give me anything. You sitting with me is the best present I've gotten all night." The simple honesty in his words made Grace's chest tighten with emotion. She could see the mountain of expensive presents stacked on a nearby table. Packages wrapped in gold foil and silver ribbon, gifts that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries. But the fact that this lonely boy valued her company above all those material things told her everything she needed to know about his character. "Well, that's mighty sweet of you to say," Grace said, reaching into the pocket of her uniform. "But my grandmama always told me that birthdays should come with gifts from the heart. Not because you have to, but because you want to." Her fingers found the small object she'd been carrying for weeks, unsure why she'd brought it tonight. She'd carved it during her breaks, sitting in her small apartment above the garage, whittling away at a piece of oak she'd found in the mansion's garden after a storm. It had started as just something to keep her hands busy, but as she'd worked on it, she'd thought about Marco more and more. Grace pulled out a small wooden horse, no bigger than her palm. It was beautiful in its simplicity, smooth curves worn soft by countless hours of careful work, a flowing mane carved with delicate precision, and 4 strong legs positioned mid-gallop. The wood had been polished to a warm honey color that seemed to glow in the ballroom's crystal light. "Oh my gosh!" Emma whispered, stepping closer without realizing it. "Did you make that?" Grace looked up, surprised to find herself surrounded by curious faces. Tommy, Emma, Ashley, and 3 other children had formed a loose circle around Marco's table, all staring at the wooden horse with fascination. "I did," Grace said softly, suddenly feeling shy about her simple gift in this room full of luxury. "I found this piece of oak in the garden after that big storm we had last month. It seemed a shame to let it go to waste, so I carved it into something beautiful." Marco reached out with trembling hands. "For me? Really? Really?" Grace said, placing the horse gently in his palms. "Every birthday boy should have a horse, don't you think? This one's special though. See, horses represent freedom, the ability to go anywhere, do anything. Sometimes when our bodies can't take us where we want to go, our spirits still can." Marco's eyes filled with tears as he cradled the wooden horse. His fingers traced every curve, every carefully carved detail. In a room filled with the latest video games, expensive electronics, and designer clothes, this simple piece of carved wood felt like the most precious thing he'd ever held. "It's perfect," he whispered. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Tommy leaned in closer. "Wow, that's really cool. You can see every muscle in its legs. How long did it take you to make?" "About 3 weeks," Grace admitted. "I worked on it during my breaks, little by little. Sometimes the best things can't be rushed." Ashley, who rarely spoke above a whisper, found her voice. "My dad has a woodworking shop in our basement. He says carving horses is one of the hardest things to do because you have to capture their spirit, not just their shape." "Your daddy's a wise man." Grace nodded. "This little fellow here, he's got fight in him. See how his head's held high? How his legs look like they're ready to run through any storm. That's the spirit I was trying to capture." Emma sat down in one of the empty chairs around Marco's table without asking permission. "Can I see it up close?" Marco looked at Grace, who nodded encouragingly, then carefully passed the horse to Emma. As she examined it, more children gravitated toward the table, drawn by the quiet magic of something created with love rather than bought with money. "This is better than anything in the toy store," declared Jake Morrison, an 8-year-old who was notorious for being hard to impress. "It's like real art." For the first time all evening, Marco found himself at the center of attention for something wonderful rather than something tragic. The children weren't looking at his wheelchair with pity or awkwardness. They were looking at his gift with genuine admiration and curiosity. "Tell us more about how you made it," Tommy said, settling into another chair. "Did you use special tools?" As Grace began explaining the carving process, more chairs filled around Marco's table. The birthday boy sat straighter in his wheelchair, the wooden horse clutched protectively in his hands, surrounded by the very thing he'd wished for all evening, friends who wanted to be there simply because they wanted to be. Vincent Rossetti stood motionless near the grand piano, a crystal tumbler of aged whiskey forgotten in his hand. For 30 minutes, he'd watched something impossible unfold at his son's birthday table, a miracle he couldn't have orchestrated with all his power, money, or influence. Marco was laughing. Not the polite, careful laughter he'd learned to produce for adults who expected bravery from a 12-year-old who'd lost the use of his legs. This was the sound Vincent remembered from before. Pure, unguarded joy that bubbled up from someplace deep and genuine. The change had started with Grace Washington. Vincent's steel-gray eyes tracked every detail of the scene. 7 children now surrounded Marco's table, all of them leaning in, asking questions about the wooden horse, listening to Grace's stories, and, most miraculous of all, treating his son like any other kid at the party. Emma Henderson was showing Marco how to balance the horse on its hind legs. Tommy Richardson was explaining a woodworking technique his father had taught him. Ashley Chun, who barely spoke to adults, was animatedly describing a book she'd read about wild horses. For the first time in 3 years, Vincent's son wasn't the disabled kid everyone felt sorry for. He was just Marco, a smart, funny 12-year-old boy with friends gathered around his table. And it had taken a woman who earned less in a year than Vincent spent on his suits. The irony cut deeper than any enemy's blade ever had. Vincent Rossetti, who controlled half of Chicago's underground economy, who had federal judges on his payroll and in his pocket, who could make problems disappear with a phone call, he'd been powerless to solve the one problem that mattered most. His son's loneliness had been beyond the reach of his empire. But Grace Washington, armed with nothing more than kindness and a hand-carved wooden horse, had accomplished in one evening what Vincent's wealth hadn't managed in 3 years. The realization hit him like a physical blow. All those elaborate birthday parties, expensive gifts, hired entertainers, he'd been trying to buy his son's happiness the same way he bought everything else. With money. With power. With fear when necessary. But happiness, real happiness, couldn't be purchased or threatened into existence. Vincent's mind drifted to the accident that had changed everything. The drunk driver had been a lie, a comfortable story for the newspapers. The truth was uglier. Marco's school bus had been hit by one of Vincent's enemies, a message written in twisted metal and his son's broken spine. The rival family had wanted to hurt Vincent where it would cut deepest, and they'd succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. For 3 years, Vincent had carried the weight of that guilt. Every specialist he'd flown in from around the world, every experimental treatment, every piece of adaptive equipment, it had all been penance, attempts to undo what his lifestyle had cost his child. But tonight, watching Grace's simple act of compassion transform his son's world, Vincent realized he'd been approaching it all wrong. Marco didn't need to be fixed. He needed to be seen, valued, included. He needed someone to sit with him not because they pitied him, but because they genuinely enjoyed his company. Tommy Marconi appeared at Vincent's elbow. "Boss? The photographer's asking about the group shots again." Vincent didn't take his eyes off his son's table. "Tell him to wait. And tell the staff to start clearing the other tables. Everyone can eat at Marco's table tonight." Tommy blinked in surprise. "All of them? But sir, that's gonna be crowded." "That's the point," Vincent said quietly. "My son's got friends for the first time in 3 years. We're not breaking that up for pictures." As Tommy hurried away, Vincent watched Grace lean over to help Marco demonstrate how the wooden horse's legs were carved to suggest movement. Her dark face was animated with the same joy that lit up his son's features. She'd given Marco more than a gift, she'd given him dignity, belonging, the simple pleasure of being a child among children. Vincent had spent his entire adult life understanding power dynamics, reading people, identifying what motivated them. Grace Washington had nothing to gain from sitting with Marco. Her job was secure, her position in the household established. She wasn't networking or seeking favor. She'd simply seen a lonely child and decided to do something about it. It was the purest act of kindness Vincent had witnessed in decades. He walked to the string quartet and whispered something to the conductor. The music faded away, leaving only the sound of children's laughter and animated conversation. Every adult in the ballroom turned toward him expectantly. Vincent Rossetti had given many speeches in his life, to business partners, to judges, to men who understood that disagreeing with him could be hazardous to their health. But this speech felt different. This one mattered. He raised his whiskey glass, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for a moment." The room fell silent except for the continued chatter at Marco's table, which Vincent made no effort to quiet. "Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of my son's 12th birthday," Vincent began, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "I spared no expense, hired the best of everything, invited the most important people I know. But the most important moment of this evening came from someone I never thought to put on the guest list." He turned slightly toward Grace, who looked up in surprise, her dark eyes wide with uncertainty. "Sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected places," Vincent continued. Tonight, I learned that money can buy many things, but it can't buy the kind of human connection that turns a lonely child into the happiest kid in the room. So I'd like to propose a toast, not just to Marco on his birthday, but to the people who remind us what really matters. To the unseen hearts that make life rich. As glasses rose throughout the ballroom, Vincent's eyes met Grace's across the room. In that moment, something passed between them: gratitude, respect, and the recognition that sometimes the most powerful people in a room are the ones nobody notices. Marco looked up from his wooden horse, his face glowing with happiness, and for the first time in 3 years, Vincent Rossetti felt like he'd given his son exactly what he needed. As the grandfather clock in the corner chimed 10 o'clock, the birthday party that had begun in elegant isolation was ending in joyful chaos. Marco's table had become the center of the entire celebration, with children and adults alike drawn to the infectious warmth that radiated from the once lonely birthday boy. Emma Henderson was teaching Marco a complex hand-clapping game, both of them dissolving into giggles when they missed the rhythm. Tommy Richardson had convinced his father to let him stay an extra hour, promising to tell Marco all about his upcoming baseball tryouts. Ashley Chin, who'd barely spoken to anyone all evening, was now chattering excitedly about organizing a playdate next weekend. "We could meet at the park near the lake," she was saying. "There's this great path that's perfect for wheelchairs, and they have the best ice cream stand in the city." Marco's face lit up. "Really? You'd want to hang out again?" "Of course," Emma said, as if the question was ridiculous. "You're funny and smart, and Grace taught us that cool thing about spotting different types of clouds. Plus, I want to hear more of her grandmother's stories." Grace smiled at the mention of her name, but was already beginning to clear empty plates from the table with practiced efficiency. The magic of the evening had been perfect, but she understood that all magic must eventually fade back into ordinary life. She had work to finish, and morning would come early. "Mrs. Grace," Marco called softly as she reached for his cake plate. "You don't have to clean up yet. The party's not over." "Oh, sweetheart," Grace said gently. "The party's not over for you. But I got responsibilities to take care of. Besides, you got new friends to talk with now. You don't need old Grace hanging around." "Yes, I do," Marco said with sudden intensity, clutching the wooden horse tighter. "I'll always need you. You made this the best birthday ever." Grace's eyes misted as she looked down at this brave, sweet boy who'd spent most of his party alone until she'd found the courage to cross invisible lines. "And you made an old woman remember why kindness matters, baby. Don't you forget that." She squeezed his shoulder gently, then continued her work, moving with the same quiet efficiency that had defined her 15 years in this house. But something fundamental had shifted. The other staff members watched her with new respect, having witnessed her transform the evening through simple human decency. The guests, too, looked at her differently, not as invisible help, but as the person who'd created the night's most meaningful moment. Vincent watched from across the room as Grace orchestrated the cleanup with professional grace, never drawing attention to herself despite being the architect of his son's happiness. When she passed near him carrying a tray of empty glasses, he stepped into her path. "Grace," he said quietly, using her first name for the first time in 15 years. She stopped, looking up at him with careful respect. "Yes, Mr. Rossetti?" Vincent struggled for words that could adequately express what she'd given his family tonight. Finally, he simply said, "Thank you for seeing him. For caring when you didn't have to." "Sir," Grace replied softly, "caring ain't something you have to do. It's something you choose to do. And your boy makes that choice easy." Vincent nodded, understanding passing between them that transcended their different worlds. "If you ever need anything at all, you come to me directly. Not through Sophia, not through anyone else. You understand?" Grace's eyes widened slightly at this unprecedented offer, but she simply nodded. "Thank you, sir. That means more than you know." As she disappeared into the kitchen, Vincent turned back to watch his son. Marco was showing the wooden horse to Mrs. Patterson, explaining with animated gestures how Grace had carved it from storm-damaged oak. The federal judge's wife was listening with genuine interest, asking questions about the craftsmanship and the symbolism. "It's not just a horse," Marco was explaining seriously. "Grace said it represents freedom and spirit. She said sometimes when our bodies can't take us where we want to go, our spirits still can." Vincent felt his throat tighten at his son's words. 3 years of the best doctors, the most expensive treatments, the most advanced equipment, and it had taken a woman with calloused hands and a kind heart to give Marco what he truly needed: the belief that he was whole exactly as he was. The evening wound down gradually, with promises of future playdates and genuine expressions of affection. Parents who'd arrived with reluctant children left with kids begging for return invitations. Emma hugged Marco goodbye, promising to call tomorrow. Tommy shook his hand like a grown-up, welcoming him to what he called the crew. Ashley whispered that she'd never had a friend who listened as well as he did. As the last guests departed, Marco sat in his wheelchair in the now quiet ballroom, the wooden horse cradled in his hands like a precious treasure. Vincent approached slowly, settling into the chair Grace had occupied hours earlier. "Some party, huh?" Vincent said softly. Marco looked up at his father with eyes bright with joy and something else: hope. "Dad, do you think Grace would teach me to carve? I want to make something beautiful too." Vincent smiled, thinking about the woman who'd reminded him that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought, only given freely. "I think she'd like that very much." Marco held up the wooden horse, watching it catch the light from the crystal chandelier. "I'm going to keep this forever. And I'm going to remember this night forever too." As they sat together in the gentle quiet of the ballroom, surrounded by the evidence of an evening that had transformed from almost disappointment into perfect joy, Vincent realized that his son had learned something infinitely more valuable than any lesson money could buy: that kindness creates miracles, that friendship can bloom in the most unexpected moments, and that sometimes the most important gifts come from the most humble hands. The birthday that almost wasn't had become the birthday that changed everything.